Hello and welcome to What's the World Coming to? Last week, one of the main topics that showed up in the news was the Gaza peace plan that had been presented by President Trump. And the question really is the peace plan that Trump is proposing, will it really truly bring peace in the Middle East? Usually when we in the West speak about times of peace, we talk about something being settled to the point where it doesn't have to be readdressed. And yet when you talk about the Middle East, that seems to be really an oxymoron because peace only lasts for a certain amount of time. And I think that part of it, what we have to understand is the very dynamics of the Islamic religion. I think that one of the things we find is that Islam is really an ideology more than it is an ethnicity. In other words, when we talk about Islam or a Muslim, we think of somebody who is an Arab. Yet most of the Muslims in the world are not Arabs. They had an Arab ethnicity. In other words, they came out of the Badu, the Bedouin culture, which we associate with the Arab people. And yet there are many Arabs who are Christians. There's many Arabs who are even Jews. And so that ethnicity doesn't carry across the board 100%. But most Arabs today would be called Muslims, but not all Muslims are Arabs. I don't mean to be coming across like I'm doing a doublespeak, but it's an important distinction to make. Yet at the same time, that Arab ethnicity is something that you have to adopt if you're going to become a convert to Islam, because Islam is essentially formulated in the 7th century under the teaching of Muhammad and held in the Quran. In the Quran, we know dates. In fact, the earliest manuscripts from the Quran come from about 685 AD. And so they were written with possibly even within the lifetime of Muhammad. And they've changed very little. And that's the interesting part, because in the mind of the Islamic community, the ideal perfect state of being was to bring your life into complete conformity and agreement with the world as it was understood through the eyes of Muhammad and those who were his initial followers. Now, when we think about the conflict that exists right now between the Muslims and the Jews, it may be kind of confusing to us. It doesn't make any sense because we try to look at economic and geographic and even socio-political dynamics that could come into play. And all those things are there, but they're not the root of the problem. They're not the heart of the problem. In fact, I would suggest you, if we look to Scripture, we find that the conflicts go all the way back to Abraham and his son Ishmael, his first naturally born son, Ishmael, who he had to his wife's handmaid, Hagar, who was an Egyptian. And it's interesting because we know the story how Abraham was instructed by God to send Ishmael away so he wouldn't compete with Isaac, because it was God's plan to use the child of promise, the one that was birthed by miraculous intervention through Sarah, whose womb was dead. She was 90 years of age. He was 100, and they had a child. Well, the significant event was a miracle of God, but also tells us that the real generation of the Hebrew people came as an act of God's gracious and miraculous intervention in world affairs. And so we find this repeated oftentimes, that not the person who is the progenitor, as we say it, in other words, the direct heir hereditarily becomes the king or the leader. It's often somebody who God chooses. We take the example of certainly Jacob, and we have Joseph, and even the tribe of Judah, being from where the kings of Judah came from. None of those were the firstborn. So God passed by those who might have what they call the right of progeniture, the idea that you're a king and then your son or your eldest son, surviving son, becomes the king after you. And we find God simply passing over certain individuals, looking for people who have a foundation of faith in him, as opposed in simply feeling like they're entitled or they have a right to that position of inheritance. And so Ishmael was sent away. And it's interesting what the Lord said about Ishmael. He said he would bless Ishmael, but he would have a characteristic. And listen to what it says in Genesis 16. He will be a wild donkey of a man. Now, wild donkey means basically he won't be settled in a place. He will be a wanderer, which was characteristic of the Badu or the Bedouin people. They wandered from place to place. In fact, some etymologists believe that the word Arab literally means desert dweller. And so they didn't have an idea of a settlement as much as they had simply wandering across the wilderness. It goes on and says, his hand will be against everyone. and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will be in defiance of all his brothers. So it's interesting because historians tell us that the Ishmael's descendants lived really in a constant tension from the people surrounding them. They were always viewed as being people who would intrude. In fact, violence became a very key defining characteristic of them, the idea of living by the sword. And basically, the idea of attacking and plundering and stealing was inherent in their cultural dynamic. And so when you look at that, you say there are certain things that kind of are repeated generationally, and they become not genetically woven into us, but culturally, ethnically woven into the way people view the world. In other words, your view of the world around you is to a large degree the consequence of how your parents raised you and how they viewed the world. And so essentially, before there was screen time, before there was Facebook and internet and Twitter and TikTok and all the rest, people formulated their ideas of the world based upon the people who immediately surrounded them. You do that for multiple generations, and you'll find that there is kind of a settled disposition, and that you might even say genetically it favors the people in that culture who most fully embrace that view of reality. But then we have a second part of the story, another part of the Arab community, which was the descendants of Esau. As was the case with Ishmael, so also Esau was the firstborn, but was passed over because he didn't value the birthright, and he didn't really want to hold on to his position. And as a consequence, it went to Jacob. Now, interestingly, what did God say about Esau? He said, "By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother, but when you grow restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck." In other words, basically, he said there would be this history of being superseded by his brother Jacob, and yet time would come when he would break loose from that. Now, why do I think that's significant? Because one of the things we find in looking at the Islamic world is that they basically claim that they're the heirs of Abraham through Ishmael, even though the Old Testament, which predates the Quran by over 1,000 years, made it very clear that God had chosen Isaac over Ishmael. But nonetheless, that's their theology, their rewriting of the theology, if you will. They're reconstituting it. But what this has also bred is a generational hostility towards the Jewish people. In fact, it's referred to as a ancient hostility or an eternal enmity in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 35. And so we find that this is something that hasn't just arisen recently, but there's been a resentment and a hatred towards the Jews going back millennia. Well, that's why when we look at Islam today, and we look at the efforts to find peace between Israel and the Jews, we find that there's really kind of a ridiculous kind of rhetoric, because when they talk about a two-state solution, one of the things you have to understand is that the Muslim world isn't interested in a two-state solution. But you have to understand that they have a view of dealing with these kind of problems that we would consider to be fault or lack of integrity. And it comes really from the teachings of Muhammad, which are somewhat contradictory. Keep in mind, when we talk about the Quran, we have that part of the Quran that was written in Medina, where Muhammad first started his movement, and then we have the second part, which was written in Mecca. And there's a difference in the focus, because when they were in Medina, they were in the preeminence. They were controlling that community. When they were in Mecca, they were not. And it's interesting because first, we find in the Quran 73:10, Muhammad tells his followers, "So be patient over what they say and avoid them with gracious avoidance." In other words, he essentially said, live at peace with people when you are the weaker party. But when you come into a place where you are the more powerful party, then your approach changes. In fact, a more assertive measure is outlined when he says, "When the sacred months have passed, then kill the polytheists." Now, keep in mind, what is a polytheist? Immediately we think about people who worship many gods, whether they be Greeks, Romans, or even Indian, people in India, Hindus. But you see, we're considered to be polytheist, that is, if you're a Christian, because you worship Father, Son, Holy Ghost. And they would say, well, you're worshiping three gods. We say, no, we see one God who expresses himself in three ways. But the reality is they consider us to be polytheists. And he says, so kill them wherever you find them and capture them and besiege them and sit and wait for them at every place of ambush. But if they repent, establish prayer and give zakah, and then let them go on their way. Indeed, Allah is forgiving and merciful. In other words, if they convert to Islam, then they can be spared. Well, when you try to understand the spread of Islam across the Middle East and many places in the world, you realize that much of the evangelism of Islam in the first centuries was by the sword. They conquered and they gave people a choice. You can convert, or you can die, or you can maybe go into exile and move away to someplace else where we aren't yet. But there's also a concept within Islam, within the Hadith, that once a territory has been under Muslim authority, every Muslim is committed to entering into jihad. Jihad means to struggle, but part of jihad, there's different kinds of struggle, but the one jihad that you need to engage in is physical violence and force to drive those people out of those territories. So even today, when we look at modern day Spain, Spain used to be under the Berbers, who were Muslims, and now it's under Christians, or, sort of Christians. Not really, it's more under a Marxist socialist, but nonetheless, it's completely changed. And so there's this idea that that is part of the territory that they should take. But the bigger problem for the Islamic community is that Palestine, or Israel, is under the control of not only non-Muslims, but it's under the control of Jews. And there's an added dimension of frustration that most of the Muslims feel with regards to Israel. And that's the fact that they are so successful. They're so prosperous. In other words, if the Jews were living in Israel and they were struggling with the same kind of economic and social and political dynamics that the Muslims suffered under, well, they might not be nearly as irritated. But one of the things they have a problem with is that Israel is one of the most advanced economies and civilizations in the entire world. Second, really, in many ways, only to the United States. And I would say that in many ways, Israel today exceeds what you find in much of Europe as well. They are the #1 per capita leader in scientific developments, medically, technology, and so forth. In other words, if you like your iPhone, thank the Israelis because they're the ones who developed it. So when you look at these things, and you see this ascendancy, you see the economic prosperity they have, as well as the fact that it is a democratically run country and you do have civil rights. You do live there in a relative degree of peace and prosperity. And it may sound terrible from all the news reports as if Israel's being invaded every second minute. But the reality is that life expectancy is much shorter in the surrounding Muslim countries, much harder, much more difficult. In fact, someone like me who is not a big fan of socialized medicine, because everywhere in the world where I see it's practiced, it usually, the older you get, the less of a value and benefit is. Once you reach 65, it's hard to get anything done. But the same thing, I mean, if you have to wait for 8 months for a heart transplant or a bypass, then maybe you never get a transplant. But the point is, it doesn't really work very well around the world, except in Israel. Israel costs $40 or $50 a month to have lifetime health care, and some of the best health care in the world. So for me, it's the only place in the world where socialized medicine actually works effectively. But that's another topic. But the thing I think is really important is when you're in the Muslim world, you're just across the Jordan River. You're just up above the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, or across the river of Egypt in below the Sinai, below Gaza. You can just simply look across the border and see the comparison of a prosperous, rich, and peaceful place where people have rights and abilities to further themselves and to educate themselves and move as far as they can. In fact, I remember some years ago when somebody was asking Arabs who are living in Israel if they would like to go back to the Arab countries. They said no. Absolutely. They wanted Israel to become an Arab country, a Muslim country, but they didn't want the rights and privileges and prosperity that they had in Israel to go away. And you see, those are kind of oxymorons, because in the Islamic view, the material world is not important. It's not secondary. And you see it when you travel between these countries. You go across the border into Jordan or into Egypt or even into Lebanon, and suddenly you're struck by the fact that things are in such a state of disorder and decay. They're not neat. They're not concerned about nature. There's trash and garbage all over the place. Because in their thinking, their ideology, if you will, these are not important things, and so we shouldn't put a lot of effort into worrying about them. They also don't embrace the idea of a democratic style or Republican style of government where there happens to be people voting and having power, government that's by the people and for the people, as we have in our country, as they have in Israel. Because what they believe in is a single autocratic ruler. Now, there are the Sunni Muslims and there are the Shia Muslims. If you're a Sunni Muslim, you're looking for the Caliph, which is really the Arabic word for king, who is going to be God's appointed king to rule over all the Muslim world. And if you're from Iran and you're a Shia Muslim, you're looking for the Imam because they believe the one who rules over them should be a religious leader who leads by enforcing the keeping of the Quran. But either one are very tyrannical, despotic, and basically don't have concerns for the individual, and they almost always turn into being rather corrupt systems where people who are closest to the power become the richest and most prosperous. But to say all of that, as we look at these dynamics and kind of begin to understand, especially this great divide between the Sunni Muslims and the Shia Muslims. Now, keep in mind, Sunni Muslims make up about 70% of the Islamic world, and they are followers of a guy by the name of Abu Bakr. In other words, when Muhammad died, Abu Bakr, who was his closest associate, was voted to become the leader of the Islamic world in the Muslim religion. Now, his Muhammad's son-in-law by the name of Ali believed that he should have that right because he was the closest relative to Muhammad. And that split began in the 7th or 8th, early 8th century and has continued up into the present time. And so interestingly, the Iranians are Shia and the rest of the Muslim world pretty much is Sunni. I should say that Iran is Shia, so is Yemen, and so are parts of Iraq and so forth, various parts. And so they have this great split. And for centuries, they've been waging war and killing each other in this effort to have ascendancy within the Islamic world. So the idea of warfare and conflict and this kind of vengeance and really having this feeling of being aggrieved by the other side is part of that cultural dynamic. So when we talk about making peace between the Hamas in Gaza or even Hezbollah or Islamic Jihad in Syria and other places like that, the idea that they would come to some kind of brotherhood is not very realistic, even though genetically we find that they are very closely related. The Jews and the Arabs are very closely genetically connected, and yet they are brothers like Isaac and Ishmael or Jacob and Esau who simply hate each other and have this historical grievance against one another because of being passed over by God himself. But they don't feel it. They believe it was something that was stolen from them. But that's, again, part of that whole discussion. But so when we look at the dynamics that are taking place there today, the idea that somehow they're going to come to some kind of agreement isn't very likely. In fact, what is really the concern of the Israelis, and it's a justifiable concern, is they've already had 8 or 9 different peace agreements with the Islamic world around them, and they have broken them every single time. They have violated every accord that they've ever formed with the Arab communities or the Muslim communities. And so they don't have a lot of hopefulness. You know, it's when when Reagan said about Soviet Union, he says, we need to trust and confirm. We need to be able to basically say, we'll enter into a peace agreement with you, but we have to be able to verify. I think the phrase was trust and verify more accurately. And that's the same way the Israelis view it. But that's also why they're very reluctant to take their foot off the pedal or off the neck of Hamas as they have it right now, because they know that they give them any air to breathe, they will rebel. Now, what do I know is going to happen? Well, first of all, there is going to be peace in the Middle East at some point. And I don't know how it's going to come, because if Iran had been driven down so far that there was a regime change, then I might say that the battles of Gog and Magog are off in the future quite a ways. But the fact of the matter is, we took our foot off the pedal, and we have not continued to press Iran, but allowing the regime that's in place to continue to hold their power. And they have executed hundreds, maybe thousands of Iranians in order to make sure that no rebellion against the current regime is possible. And again, we don't hear much about this in our Western media. You have to really kind of go outside of the United States to learn a lot of this stuff, but it's going on right now. They're holding on to power, and they're going to hold on to it very strongly with the desire and the design that they will rebuild to where they once were, so they can be in a place once again to fulfill what they think is their divine destiny, which is destroy Israel, and then begin to expand so that they destroy the hegemony or the power of the United States as well. And we find that the Iranians will become the reigning rulers of the world, not only the Muslim world, but also the whole world as and it's interesting because you have on the other end of the spectrum, you have modern day Turkey. And Turkey is one of these countries that usually gets overlooked because we've been focusing at Iran so long. But interesting, because when you go to Ezekiel 38 and 39, it first mentions the region which, in terms of the 8th century BC, those areas had different names: Togar, Togarma, Gomer, Meshech, Tubal, which is really much of modern day Turkey today, and also was large parts of what was called the Ottoman Empire, the last time when the Ottoman Turks were the rulers of the Middle East and much of Europe. And so they see themselves, they're Sunni Muslims, they see the Iranians as the Shia Muslims, who are the rebels and the heretics of their religion, but nonetheless they form basically an alignment of convenience. Now, let me speak a little bit about what Ezekiel 38:9 talk about. Beginning even back in Ezekiel 36, what God speaks about is how that the Jews will be regathered. The time Ezekiel is in Babylon, they're in captivity. Jeremiah had prophesied they would be there for 70 years, and he said at the end of 70 years they would come back into the land. Well, one of the things he said was in Ezekiel 36 that he would bring them back into the land. But what's really interesting is he was talking about putting a new heart in them, that they wouldn't have a heart of stone following the 10 Commandments, but they would have a heart formulated by the will of God according to the Holy Spirit. And so he talks about this, not just a return to the land, but a return to the God of their fathers. That is not something that we have completely seen in our own day and age. And many who have kind of a replacement theology say, well, that refers to the church now. We have subsumed or consumed all of the promises that were given to Israel. No, those promises apply to us. I don't agree with that theology. I think it creates more interpretive problems. In fact, I think the reason that so many people don't study the Old Testament prophecies is because they're looking at through that replacement grid. And if you do, you have to make everything into an allegory or a metaphor. It has to be figurative or symbolic. It can't be literal. I think it's supposed to be read the way it's written, and it's written very literally and should be understood literally. That's really a kind of a little snapshot of my particular point of view. Don't have to get time to go into it further, but when you come to chapter 37 of Ezekiel, he talks about the valley of dead bones and how it comes back to life. In other words, he's talking about the rebirth, I believe, of national Israel. And this, again, becomes a point that confuses many people because they look at the nation of Israel today, and, 80 to 90% of Jews in Israel today are non-observant Jews. I mean, they keep the holidays because it's kind of a tradition. But up until very recently, they really didn't take faith all that seriously. It was their traditional religion in the same way that Christianity is in our culture. But they were just Jews in name only. They saw their Jewishness in their ethnicity. And so to become a Jewish citizen, if your mother was Jewish, then you could become a Jewish citizen today, even if you live in America. You can have that dual citizenship. So they saw it as being a more of a genetic, ethnic type of alignment. But we find that today that's shifting and that's changing. And so people look at that and saying, well, they're not spiritual people. They're not religious people. And only 5% of them are really what we call orthodox in the very strictest sense of keeping the law. So, and the rest are someplace in between. In fact, interestingly, there's a growing number of believers or Christians in the country right now as well. But be that as it may, people look at that and say, how can you say that these are God's chosen people? And part of it is the historical reality that they're still there. The very fact that they've come back into the land and they've come back to reform the nation. They're the only nation in the history of the world that has ever been destroyed twice, carried away into captivity, sold into slavery, dispersed upon the face of the earth, and have come back and reformed their national identity. And the nation of Israel today is the only time. This didn't happen under the first regathering under Ezra and Nehemiah because they never had an independent state. From return from Babylon all the way up until modern times, they were always under the authority, their power, the governance of a greater power or authority, whether it be the Romans or the Byzantines, or you just kind of go through history, the Ottomans and so forth. They never had that national identity as they have today. And I believe that's because they are the valley of dry bones that have come back to life. But they haven't come to faith yet. Paul said to the Romans, he said, in the last days, all Israel shall be saved, which tells me, as I see them back in the land and I see a renewed openness to the gospel. I mean, quite honestly, many Jews today will tell you the only friends we have in the world right now are the evangelical Christians who believe in biblical prophecy being literally fulfilled. And so you find even within the church, there are many people who are into what we call the replacement theology, who basically say God's done with them, the promises have been consumed or subsumed by the church, and therefore when you see Israel, it's talking about the church and not Israel. And yet God said to Abraham, I'm making an everlasting covenant with you and your descendants after you. So either God doesn't mean everlasting when he says everlasting, or he's changed his mind and therefore can't be trusted in other areas, or he is keeping his promise as he said in Scripture. I think that's a conundrum that people who are saying that Israel has been replaced have to work through, have to figure out, because either God keeps his olam, his everlasting promises, or he doesn't. And I don't think you can really cut that any other way. But it's also interesting because he said after they are restored as a nation, at least this is the way I read Ezekiel 37, then he said there will come a great assault against them by a coalition of nations, which if you look to the map as it was really laid out in the 8th century BC, and you look at it and apply it to the 21st century that we're in, what we see is those are all Middle Eastern Islamic ruled countries, from Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan and right around to Egypt and to Libya and to Ethiopia and all these other countries that are controlled, Sudan in particular, who are Islamic-led countries who have their focus upon Israel as being the curse that needs to be removed, the stain that needs to be washed from the land. And so when you hear people chanting from the river to the sea, it's very clear that what they're speaking about is the annihilation of the Jewish people. In fact, it was Yasser Arafat, who was the founder of the current Palestinian state, who said that they would drive out the Jews and they'd make them drink seawater. In other words, would drive them right into the Mediterranean Ocean. Ironically, that's literally what's happened today, because Israel now gets 90% of their water, their drinking water from, and their irrigation water from the Mediterranean Ocean, because they have the most advanced desalination systems in the world, which they're willing to share with the Arab countries, but they don't want to take it because they can't accept anything from Israel, lest they be viewed as being a collaborator and a betrayer of the Islamic faith. It becomes a very complex political dynamic, social interactive dynamic, as you can understand. But what's also interesting is that what Zechariah said in Zechariah chapter 12 is that Israel, and Jerusalem in particular, was going to be the focal point of end-time histories. We even see this in the book of Revelation, where it talks about how that the two prophets are prophesying and they die in the streets of Jerusalem. And we know it's Jerusalem. He said it because it's Sodom and Egypt, where our Lord was crucified, which is only one place, and that can be Jerusalem. Also, we just know that there's going to be a rebuilt temple in the last days, a third temple that's going to come on the scene, where the Antichrist puts his image and betrays the Jews and commands the world to worship him. So all these dynamics tell us that Jerusalem is going to be the center point. But also when we look at Zechariah chapter 12, he tells us, I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. Basically said they're going to be acting like men who are intoxicated and they can't stand up straight. They're so drunk. He says, Judah will be besieged as well as Jerusalem. On that day, when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. Now, one of the things we find is that today, not all the nations of the world are militated against Israel, but it's moving in that direction at a pace that's kind of shocking to me. When the United Nations, representing 190 different nations, basically passed a resolution saying that Israel was at fault for being attacked by Hamas, well, you begin to understand that there is an inherent desire to wipe out Israel or to diminish them to the point where they're no longer a point of conflict. It'd take me too long to get into all the individualized dynamics behind what other countries are hoping for. But the bottom line is that there are very few countries that are still standing with Israel, and the United States may be the only one who's doing it seriously. And so, as a consequence, when we look at this peace deal that Trump is trying to push through, I don't think that Donald Trump is looking at Israel and the conflict through the lens of biblical prophecy, because we know that there's going to be peace at some point, but that peace is going to be really the beginning of the last days in many ways, because in chapter 38 of Ezekiel, in verse 11, when he's talking about this battle of Gog and Magog, the battle between Israel and the surrounding nations that are all around it, he says the following, that Gog will invade the land of unwalled villages, and I will attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people, all of them living without walls and without gates and without bars. Now, one of the reasons Israel suffered the invasion that they did on October 7th, 2022, was because they had become unsuspecting. They'd assumed that Hamas was basically not really a threat to them, and they didn't really pay much attention to it. It was an intelligence failure. It was also a military failure of huge consequence, because they were so sure that during the Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur celebration period in Israel, that they were going to have trouble up in the north in Judea or in Palestine, that they really moved most of their troops there and only had a skeleton force along the border with Gaza. And so they left themselves unprepared, and their intelligence system failed to recognize that. And there's all sorts of discussions why that happened. But the bottom line was they broke through their walls and they murdered 1,200 people in the most horrific and savage ways you can imagine. But having said all of that, what we find is that the one thing I found talking to my Israeli friends is the thing they want more than anything for themselves and for their children and their grandchildren is to live in peace. I was talking to one Israeli soldier one time about this, and he said, I was telling how a lot of our soldiers coming back from the Middle East were suffering from PTSD, and he started laughing. He said, everybody in Israel has PTSD. We just live with it because we've been constantly under attack. We've never been safe. And every time we thought we made peace, they eventually, once they got to where they were in a position of strength, they would attack us again. And it comes repeatedly. So today, when you live in Israel, even though we see the vulnerability that happened October 7th, it is a walled and armed nation. There are walls and fences and gates. In fact, one of the great controversies is that Israel has built this massive 40, 50-foot wall all along the border separating Jerusalem, occupied parts of Jerusalem with the Jews, and the Palestinians on the other side. And the Palestinians who are on the other side, who are always coming in and doing nefarious things, say now they've imprisoned us. Well, the truth of the matter is that there's savage unemployment in the Palestinian areas because they spend all of their energy on trying to find ways to destroy Israel, not to try to build their own economy. Even after the Oslo Accords in the early 90s, when Europe and the United States were sending billions of dollars to Palestine, where was that money going? Well, a lot of it began to pop up on mansions built by the Palestinian leaders on the hilltops, the mountains of Samaria. So, the money doesn't seem to make its way to really helping the average guy go to school, get an education, build a business, and create a life all of their own. But because of the constant threat, and it's interesting, once they built those massive walls, that terrorism dropped by 99%? 99%? It should tell you when people say walls don't work. Well, come into my neighborhood and I have fences around my yard. And guess what? When I put up a fence, the deer stopped eating my flowers and my fruits and my vegetables. So they work. But the whole point is it's such a nonsense statement that people say over and over again because they live in a fortified nation right now. Israel is a fortified country. Most people carry weapons. Most people are militarily trained, and you never really leave the military until you can't crawl out of your bed. So I have friends who are in their 60s now who are still serving on active duty in Israel because they need their military expertise and experience, and they're still in pretty good shape. But to say that, we need to understand that they are people who are constantly living in this vigilant state. They're not living peacefully in unwalled cities. Every village you come into throughout Israel will have a large fence, usually a with surveillance cameras and electrification wires, and they have massive gates that are electronic and controlled, and on it goes, because they know that they're constantly under threat. So what Ezekiel is talking about, and I always come back to this, is saying to people who are always saying, well, we're on the verge of Gog and Magog. We will not see the battle of Gog and Magog until we see a resolution of the conflict. And my thought and my concern to some degree is that what we're seeing is an expression of that would cause the Israelis to let down their barriers. And they won't do it quickly, but they'll see what's happening on the other side. But as long as Iran has still a breath in its lungs, as long as Hamas is still surviving someplace to some degree, and Islamic Jihad and ISIS and Hezbollah, even though these enemies have been tremendously diminished, and as my friends tell me, it's safer in Israel than it probably has ever been in their lifetime, because all of these enemies have been so terribly diminished. The reality is they're still getting missiles fired from Yemen, or sometimes even out of Gaza at this point. And so the conflict is always right there in front of them. And the last thing they're going to do is disarm. And so the thing I think is really interesting about Ezekiel 38 and 39, it said that it's not going to take place until the Jews, the Israeli people, the Israeli nation has been convinced that there's no longer a threat from their neighbors. And then they will let down their guard. It's amazing when you think about it, because we're not there yet. But I think something else that I would just kind of emphasize again, I made this point earlier, but I want to reiterate it again. When you're thinking about looking at the end times, and especially thoughts about the Battle of Gog and Magog, don't overlook Turkey. Iran has been beaten pretty close back to the Stone Age. They are not in a position to threaten Israel, much less mount an invasion from where they are into the mountains of Jerusalem or Israel. But you have to keep in mind, Turkey has the largest army, not only in the Middle East, they have the largest army in NATO. They have bought anti-aircraft missiles from Russia, the SAM-4, the most advanced probably anti-aircraft missiles that there are in the world. And they're a NATO nation. They're part of NATO. They're part of Europe. Actually, most people don't realize that, because they're more European than they are Middle Eastern. But nonetheless, they also are really they've actually paid for F-16s and F-35s from the United States, and President Trump is not selling them to them until he has an assurance that they won't be a threat to Israel. And why would he have that concern? Because the prime minister, a guy by the name of Recep Erdogan is a part of the Muslim Brotherhood. And who else is part of the Muslim Brotherhood? Hamas. Hamas is part of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so what Recep has in mind, he sees basically Turkey rebuilding the Ottoman Empire. He is playing to be the leader of the Muslim world. And with Iran conveniently beaten back into the Stone Age, or retarded significantly in their development of their military, he has a chance to step forward. He has his resources already in place, and he's already begun to insert himself into Lebanon, into Syria, and other places where he is controlling the game plan. So before Syria went through its recent revolution and was replaced by its new leadership, who are Sunni Muslims, they were run by a family that were Alawites, which is a Shiite sect. So the Shiites, the Iranian Shiites and their supporters, have been driven out of Syria and have been taken over. And the same thing is happening as you go into Iraq. And it's moving across that world where the Sunni influence, and particularly with its primary, most powerful leader, is Erdogan, who is in Turkey, basically pushing the agenda forward. So what has he done through this whole thing? He's done nothing but defend Hamas for their atrocities and made it very clear that he's standing with him. Sadly, my son was just over in Turkey, and he told me, he said the people there hate Erdogan, but somehow he keeps on getting reelected because essentially he is a tyrannical despot who has taken control of their electoral system and keeps on holding on to power. And he continues and hopes to do so as he builds alliances with countries like Russia and China, while at the same time being a member of NATO and pretending to be a friend of the United States. So I tell you again now, when you're looking at things and you're wondering about, is this the battle of Gog and Magog? The two things I think you should focus on. Number one, focus on whether or not there's a peace agreement that actually holds. If there's a peace agreement that takes place that looks like the conflicts are over, I mean, on one hand, I would rejoice and be so thankful because I know so many of my friends who have lived with this terror of war and assaults and terrorism for decades, in fact, their whole lives. I really want them to know a time of peace and tranquility. I want them to feel like they can play in the park with their kids or go to the beach and not have to worry about an air raid siren going off. But at the same time, I realize that that's also going to be the thing that's going to begin to create the dynamic, which will be the preparation of these Islamic countries to once again rearm in such a way to invade the land of Israel. Of course, God says they'll be destroyed and Israel will win, but he says, I will fight for you. He'll do it in such a way that they know that it's he who has done it. And they'll be brought to a place of reverence. And I think that's going to be the impetus then. I call it the death of Islam, because Islamic countries are going to be decimated, and the religion is going to be basically shown to be not what it claims to be. And as a consequence, we're going to find that the Jews are going to be renewed in their faith towards the God of Israel, and they're going to set out to rebuild the temple. I think this is also going to be, it's going to link up with the rapture of the church as well. Again, no man knows the day or the hour, because God is waiting to see how people respond to him as he moves the players across the board of the world. But keep your eye also on Turkey. In fact, if you're saying, well, I can't find a lot of information, one of the things my wife and I do is we watch Sky News and BBC and even France 1, which are European news lines, which are heavily biased against Israel in their reporting, but nonetheless, you get a lot of up-to-the-minute information about they cover the conflict that's going on in the Middle East much more carefully and much more detail than we do in our news media. So there you have it. There's a lot of the dynamics that are going on. I hope I didn't rattle through that too fast for you to be able to put it together. Of course, you can always listen to it again if you found me bearable. But I thank you for following along. And as I say, my hope is that we would realize that we don't have to be people who are living in fear, because we live in a world that is controlled by a great God, and he is the one who determines the flow of history and the timing of events. And we can be sure, because our lives are hidden in Christ, that we're also kept safe within his plan for his church and for you and me. God bless you and go in his grace.